G'day NAC TV viewers, and welcome to an in-depth discussion about copyright law and social media. Now, social media is obviously very ubiquitous in our lives, and to live without it is no longer possible. Now, the New Apostolic Church South Africa has undertaken a review of international developments in the church as well as internal practices with regards to social media. Now, to help us better understand what copyright entails, we invited Dimitri Martinez, who is a regulatory affairs expert, to the studio. Dimitri, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Welcome, Lance. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the interview.
Yeah, so am I. Now, Dimitri, let's jump straight into it. The leadership of the New Apostolic Church commissioned guidelines for social media. Now, what exactly prompted this?
So the guidelines essentially is to guide both employees and the ordinary members of the church in the use of social media. The main reason is that there are copyright implications for using it correctly and not using it correctly. So all of this is done to ensure the protection of the intellectual property of the church itself, as well as the intellectual property of external parties. So the idea is really to encourage best practice in the use of social media. The guidelines are developed to guide the creation and the setting up of communities. So for people, for example, that are setting up a Facebook fan page or their personal fan page, and we're going to get to that later on, the personal use. The idea is that now that these guidelines are going to bind each of the group of people that we've spoken about. So whether it's the spiritual leadership of the church, whether it's employees, whether it's the communications coordinators, and indeed just the ordinary members who are going to be making use, and in fact are currently making use of social media.
You mentioned intellectual property, and I'd like to come to that. What exactly is intellectual property? What does it entail?
Okay, so intellectual property is any creation of the mind. So any ideas that we put into either a piece of music, a book, a hymnal, and the idea is just like any other property, that you have a right as the owner of that to protect how it's used and how it's exploited.
Does this present any legal challenges? I mean, if you're talking about you have the right to protect that idea, if I were to sing a song, for example, and make money off that song that you had written, what kind of legal challenges does this present?
Well, that's the key issue, is making money from it. If it was simply a case of using it, and it's done in a way that doesn't infringe on my right as the originator, then it's a tricky area because, for example, you might go and your daughter is performing in one of the music concerts, and you want to film and put that onto your own social media post. Strictly speaking, you're allowed to do that. If, however, she is singing a piece of music of Mariah Carey, let's say, and you then decide to post that and charge people to view it, then we're moving into slightly grey area. But from the point of view of the church, the main purpose of the guidelines is to make sure that any use of copyright material is done according to the law. So the church normally buys the rights of music that is going to be performed, whether it's the music sheets, and what happens is that the copyright, both in performance and in recording, because there's copyright at different stages of the value chain. So the original owner of the copyright has a right to say, I'm allowing you to perform this, but not to record and broadcast it. or I'm allowing you to perform and record it. For example, you make CDs, you sell CDs, the church sells DVDs, etc. That is allowed because the copyright has been cleared. Where the leadership of the church has encountered some problems is that people are now taking material off an official site. So they might be recording off NAC TV and posting that, which that would be infringing copyright, first of all, of NAC TV itself. Then some people are putting material onto YouTube, for example, and then rebranding it as NAC in another country. But they're making use of the logos of the church. Very often it's not even the correct Pantone color. They're even changing. So just to summarize the point that I've just made, there is legitimate use of copyright material. Then there's also doing it without being aware, and I think that's one of the main reasons that these guidelines have been put out to alert the membership of your church and to inform them on the correct use of copyright materials.
Now, you mentioned this infringement of copyright and copyright infringement, and it seems like it can get quite technical. When you're talking about in a different country, are there specific regulations governing what happens in South Africa and different regulations for what happens outside of South Africa? So, for example, I obtain the rights to perform and to broadcast a piece of music. Dimitri doesn't have the right now to take a video of that performance and then rebroadcast it in another country. Am I understanding this correctly?
That's exactly right. So the rights would normally pertain to a particular territory. It would be either a country or it could be the subcontinent of Africa, Southern Africa, for example. But that it relates to a specific geographical territory. So not only is it being done outside, because remember, social media now are international platforms. So if somebody posts something on YouTube, it's available to anybody, anywhere in the world. So as we know, and we're going to get to that in a little while, the church operates a number of different social media platforms. But I know we're going to be touching on that in a little while. So,
right. Let's talk a little bit more about intellectual property and copyright and how these two interact. We've touched on what counts as intellectual property, but how do I apply my copyright rights to my intellectual property?
Okay, so as the church, for example, you have certain hymnals that have been developed. So those, as a book, as a printed a book, are copyright protected. So somebody cannot take that book, photocopy it, and then sell the photocopies or distribute them free without the permission of the church. Then you have translations, for example, that are unique to the church. And those, again, are copyrighted. Let's just talk about the hymnal. You then have sheet music, for example. So the church will buy the sheet music, and then either in a divine service or in a music concert, there'll be performance of this. That is recorded and put onto a DVD. The copyright consists in that DVD, that hard copy. So somebody cannot take that and sell it. That belongs to the church. The copyright belongs to the church. They can't, and they certainly can't make copies of that and distribute. Likewise, they cannot take that material and put it onto a YouTube channel, for example, or put it onto a Facebook page or onto an Instagram post. That belongs to the church. And so what has happened is that the church, in fact, on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, will put out new material that people can then use and upload onto their personal posts as a way, because it is important. Certainly the spiritual leadership of the church makes use of social media to get the message out.
I wanted to come back to that, because it's very important when we talk about this content that is created specifically to be shared on social media. Am I in infringement of copyright if I click share from, for example, NAC TV's Instagram page or NAC TV's Facebook page? And why not?
Not because it's an official site, and so any material that has been placed on there is done by the, let's call it either NAC TV executives, and they will only use material that they have cleared. So if there's copyright in anything, they will have cleared that. So you, as a member, an ordinary member of the church, to say, I'm sharing this with my or putting it onto my feed, that is completely legitimate.
There are many content creation websites, content creation collectives who create content specifically to be shared on traditional or mainstream media platforms. They use these and they operate under what is known as a Creative Commons license, which operates on a fair use policy. Can you explain just exactly what that entails, and how can I, as an ordinary member, put some of those learnings into practice?
So indeed, that material is created specifically for the purpose of sharing. So the owners of that material are giving you, it's an implied permission to say, I'm giving you, but it has to be done on a basis, it's a fair basis. First of all, you have to say, what is the source of this? You cannot say, I created this, and put your own branding onto it. Secondly, there's material also that where copyright has, the period of copyright has expired. So we use the example of Homer's Odyssey, which was a poem that was written in BC era. Now that continues to be used. People can quote it, they can perform it, etc. There is no person that they have to go to and ask for permission. So of course, the writer is always acknowledged, and that's often referred to as the moral rights. So as much as if you create a piece of material, you will always be the author of that material. You may decide, I'm giving somebody the rights to publish that in a certain territory. I'm giving somebody the rights to adapt it for the screen, for example. So you're passing those rights on. There may be payment, but from what they call the moral rights of the author can never be given away, as it were. You will always be known. So from the point of view of the church, material that has come through the ages, you could say, many of the hymns, they come from many years. And then we have new material that's created. And then I used the example of material where the church has actually translated into one or more of the South African languages. That is then original material that belongs to the church. The copyright belongs to the church, and only through giving rights like Creative Commons, for example, you used, that is allowed. But it's only through permission of the church.
When is something considered in the public domain? Is it just when it's old, or when does the copyright lapse? When can I just do what I want to?
Different countries have different, but it's around 50 years. So 50 years after the death of the copyright owner. Now you have certain material where let's just say, very famous composers or artists, where they have passed those rights into a trust for their children and so on. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because the person has been dead for 50 years, that it no longer, but we're talking about your really big, big names. So there's a time period after the death of the person, and also if the person themselves has given permission, sometimes for educational purposes. They say, I'm happy that my music is used for educational purposes, for religious purposes, for any particular reason. So they're giving those rights. Now, what you have is what they call collecting societies. So these are organizations that are set up and they collect money on behalf of either, let's take a piece of music. So the composer, then the person who arranged the music, then the people who performed the music. Now, each of those are different rights, and there are collecting societies that actually register. So you, as the copyright owner, would register with a collecting society, and they will make sure. So SAMRO, for example, the South African Music Rights Organization, would be giving permission for people to use the music in their repertoire. That would be one example of how you protect your copyright and then make sure that you collect any rights that are due to you.
I've got a very technical, hypothetical situation to pose at you. So if we're talking about after the author's death, and you were talking about trusts and the copyright then passes on to the trust. Let's take Agatha Christie, for example. I can't create a character modeled after Hercule Poirot and call him, I don't know, Hercules Gero.
Yes.
And I mean, how close is the guy? I could say, oh, but here's a piece of music by Mozart, and I've changed 5 notes. It's now my original work. How far does that? Is there a grey area? What is?
It's absolutely right. The fact of the matter is, especially creating characters. I mean, that's what the public knows. So they recognize that. They sometimes talk about in the creative industries that they say, the biggest form of flattery is to steal somebody's ideas. But it is still stealing. That is the bottom line. You can obviously, you have what's called, what's the word? When you do a spoof of somebody and so there's a particular character, but people know that is what you're doing. You're taking Hercule Poirot and you're creating Hercules. In that case, it is still a reference to, but you couldn't, for example, create a TV series and say, I've created an original character. So, yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about social media and social media guidelines. We've mentioned this, and we did say that we would circle back and cover this in more depth. Let's just have a look at some of the NAC's social media guidelines.
Right. So, traditional media has always been a significant feature of the life of the church. And the social media essentially is an extension of that. The rise of social media has opened up a number of new channels of communication to fulfill the mission of the church, to spread the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to strengthen community and fellowship. So each of those, you can see, fall within the domain of a different group of people. The spiritual leaders of the church, the employees of the church, and indeed your ordinary members of your congregation who want to share the fact that, I'm a member of this church, I've been to certain services, my kids go to Sunday school. So each of these different areas are done on social media. So it's important. So, for example, the current types of social media that are used by the church internationally and within South Africa is Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and these are all have their own unique characteristics. So the social media platform itself has certain rules. So if you put something on that as the church that is copyright protected, let's say onto YouTube, YouTube itself will remove. Your own YouTube channel, for example, if you put something on and somebody, for example, steals that, because there have been cases of pirating the material that you've posted, then what's called is a takedown notice. So your social media department or your communications department would contact YouTube and say, please take down that particular post because they are infringing our copyright. So those are the different platforms that are currently used by the church, and the guidelines that have been developed are also to guide the best way of putting material onto there. So the church has adopted an attitude of let's not prohibit, let's rather encourage people to use material. How do we do that? We make a gallery of photographs available, we make a gallery of videos available, and then every week there's new material, and I think it's called Throwback Thursdays, I'll get the correct term, yes?
All the hashtags.
That's it. And so that material, so you're encouraging both the people responsible for communications and your ordinary members to put this material online and to be able, they've got so much amazing material, they don't need to put a cheap and nasty little video on that.
And essentially what we'd like is for our members to, we don't want our members not to share things. We're not trying to prohibit our members from sharing their experiences and their joy of being part of this wonderful community. But it's about doing so and safeguarding yourself as well as safeguarding the church as an organization.
Well, that's the important thing, because the members would not be liable legally. What would happen is that the leadership of the church, the directors, would be held legally responsible. And in order to protect the church, these guidelines are put out, and people essentially are bound by those guidelines. They agree, if they're going to use any of the material, they agree to be bound by these rules and the guidelines.
What happens in the case, Dimitri, of a very enthusiastic rector of a congregation wants to create a specific campaign? And this is purely hypothetical. I'm not saying that there are any rectors out there who may have done this. We're watching you. And they use the church's logo, for example, in some of this material. And they maybe, as you say, don't get the Pantone. And Pantone, just for those uninformed ones, the specific code and proper color that is specifically registered to the church.
Correct.
They don't get that right. In such cases, it's not like we're trying to wag a finger at you and saying, naughty, naughty, don't do this. But we are trying to protect something much greater. It's
That's the point. So you could say, that would be the corporate image of the church. You want to make sure that the image that you're putting out is consistent. Like any other large organization that has a particular logo, you don't want to mess with that. And more importantly, you want to maintain from an editorial point of view. You want to make sure that there's certain ethical guidelines that are in place that promote the spiritual values and the principles of the church. And these things are all linked together. So the example of a pastor who wants to put a campaign together, it would be encouraged. but certainly not, for example, a political message. And that wouldn't be guided by the social media guidelines. That would be the general communications policy of the church that says, first of all, only an official spokesperson of the church can speak to the media on behalf of the church. Secondly, if there is going to be communication, these are the general guidelines. And now what we have is a very specific set of guidelines on social media itself.
Why the guidelines? Why has NAC South Africa developed these guidelines?
Okay, so the guidelines are there to give direction and guidance to different groups within the family of the church. So those who are specifically responsible for communications, whether it's from the head office or whether it's communications coordinators at a congregation level or a district level, these people are looking to the church to say, okay, what are the rules that we must follow? So that we make sure, first of all, that we're following the ethical guidelines. Now, what is important that these were developed within the context of the international church. That's essentially who sets the tone for every district, right? And what we look at is a set, I could say, a set of directions that say we want to fulfill the mission statement. We want to profess our faith. We want to strengthen the community. We want to be visible. We want the members to feel connected to their church. We want to ensure the sovereignty of information. We want to provide an opportunity to foster dialogue about church and faith. We want to offer help and answers. We want to bring people within the church together. And finally, we want to spread positive news. So those are essentially your guiding principles. And if any communication is developed, it's done so within the framework of that.
It's really just spreading the good news and good vibes, you know, and so it really, it really,
you said it.
It's just distilled down so beautifully.
And if I could pick up on that, that is exactly the point about this. This is not meant to be some kind of rigid, say, you must do this, you must do it like this. It's exactly spreading the good vibes, spreading the good news. That's what it's about.
How do I, as an ordinary member, put the learnings from this video into practice? What are the things, the practical things that I should look out for? What are the things that I should try and avoid? And what are the things that I should do more of, besides sharing NAC TV's posts all the time, by the way?
Well, you know, it's first of all trying to say, what is my motivation for doing this? Why am I wanting to post this material? Is it to spread the good news? Is it to encourage my friends and family members to join me in fellowship? So understand what are my motivations for doing it. Then, if I'm going to use any of the material, I must make sure that I go onto the NAC website. I get the material from there that I'm able to use. So I'm using the right logos, the right colors, and that is just as an ordinary member. If we're talking about people who are now responsible for communications, there we have very specific guidelines, because there you want to make sure that it's done in a consistent manner. So the international, what's called the New Apostolic Church International Codex, we talk about we respect our neighbor, we are friendly, we are honest and authentic, we respect the intellectual property of others, we act responsibly, we spread the good news, we protect the private sphere, we keep politics and business separate from church involvement. Count us in, big idea. And we don't have to know everything. So that really is, you could say, the big picture. It's against that background that the guidelines for the New Apostolic Church South Africa were developed. And of course, as an autonomous body and following the laws of South Africa and what are the laws of the land, this particular set of guidelines was developed.
Now, there are, of course, the New Apostolic Church International does have social media guidelines and a social media policy. You are welcome to visit this link that's going to be at the bottom of your screen very shortly, so you can check that out and follow those links and find out exactly and be able to understand the full social media policy of the New Apostolic Church International. Now, Dimitri, social media, look, we're living in an interesting time. COVID has changed the way we do things. The coronavirus pandemic globally has changed the way we live our lives, the way we interact with one another. And a lot of this interaction is in that social media space. And it's very important to remember that digital contact can never truly replace physical contact, albeit at a socially distanced, acceptable proximity.
Absolutely right. Of course, that is what we all want. We want that community, that sense of being together again, and with time, obviously, that is going to be coming as the lockdown regulations allow more and more of us to go back to our congregations. We can have that contact. Absolutely, this is really it adds to it, so we can record what happened there. We can share in the joy of going to even if it's a fundraising event, if it's to a Sunday school, but social media will never replace that human contact. It's
You know what's interesting about social media also? I mean, if I think about it, I look at the guidelines that the New Apostolic Church South Africa is implementing. There are specific rules. You mentioned YouTube will take down a video, and I mean, I, as someone who works in the media industry, have received these takedown notices before. We've not been in infringement of any copyright, but there have been instances where perhaps an image was used and the photographer was requesting to be paid for that image, which we sort out at a later stage. But each individual social medium has its own set of guidelines that we need to adhere to as well, and they obviously supersede the original guide or the guidelines that we are putting in place here. But who is bound by these guidelines of the New Apostolic Church South Africa? Who is bound by them? Who do these guidelines apply to?
So all members of the church family, from the spiritual leaders to the full-time employees of the church, and indeed the members of the congregation.
Very specifically, let's break it down. You did mention that these guidelines apply to everyone, from the spiritual leadership right down to the ordinary members. But what are the social media guidelines for members, staff, and congregants of the New Apostolic Church? What governs this? What is considered acceptable behavior?
So, essentially, when using any type of social media, you're encouraged to be credible, accurate, fair, thorough, and transparent. And we can unpack each of those, but you can understand that you want to maintain and promote the spiritual principles and the values of the church in any of your communication. So you don't want to be encouraging on any level misinformation, putting out information that's going to confuse people, information that is deliberately misleading those who are going to be reading the posts. You should be respectful, encourage constructive criticism and deliberation, be cordial, honest, and professional at all times, and write what you know. You have to know your facts and cite credible sources. And most important, listen before you talk. Before entering any conversation, you need to understand the context. So this, of course, is really a guideline for any professional communicator. And as you would know, somebody who's in the media, that is the basis of effective communication. So both the normal members, but more importantly, people who are doing this now on behalf, whether it's your communications coordinators or people responsible for communication and that have been authorized to do that.
So Dimitri, just to be clear, can I film a soloist singing in my congregation on a Sunday morning?
Strictly speaking, no, because you don't have the permission from the church to record that material. What you would be encouraged to do is, once that either a divine service, in this case, what would happen is that that material would be made available online or on NAC TV, and then online you could get material which you could post in turn. If you did that, if you were to record and post that, you would get the district apostle into trouble, you would get the church leadership into trouble, because there are legal implications that you as an individual member wouldn't be the one to get into trouble.
I don't want to get the district apostle into trouble. Then I'll feel really bad about that. So Dimitri, I have another question. And it relates to behavior on social media versus your behavior in real life, so to speak. When we as media professionals are hiring people and we discuss our social media policy with them, specifically when it comes to broadcast media, the newer employees would say, but what can I tweet? What can I post on Facebook? And my answer generally to them was, if you can't say it on air, then don't say it on social media. Would the same kind of comparison be applicable to a minister or an employee of the church, or even an ordinary member of the church?
Absolutely so. Absolutely. I think that's a very good example, because social media is simply an extension of that. The conversation that happens. If you are not going to behave in a certain way in a congregation, you certainly cannot behave unlike that on social media. So I think it's a very good example.
So I want to take that back to these guidelines. Can one then assume that the social media guidelines for the official NAC SA communications team is similar to that?
Very much so. They have an additional responsibility, of course, because they are responsible for communicating the official policy and position of the church. So the protocols that apply are essentially the following. We would look at respecting copyright laws. There it is, right there at number 1. And ensuring that any information that is published online is accurate and approved by the church leadership, the designated official, complying with New Apostolic Church South Africa policy on official communication. So, it's very important to see the church both in terms of its spiritual mission, but also as a corporate, as a citizen in the country. And you have a certain image, and you want to make sure that that image is consistent, it's communicated clearly, professionally, etc. Whether it's done through official media or traditional media or on social media, it's absolutely essential that is done according to those guidelines.
You mentioned being a citizen of the country, and obviously as a result of being a citizen to the country, you are then subject to the country's laws. Working in the media industry and working with photographers and videographers as well, it's very important to realize and recognize that a lot of these laws are designed to protect children and protect minors. I want to bring this back to a church context. It's cute to see a group of Sunday school children singing a hymn in church or at an event or at a gathering. But you, as the person attending that event, don't have the permission from the parents of those children to take their picture and to share it on social media. And that's also an important consideration to make.
Very much so, very much so. In fact, many organizations discourage taking photographs of children altogether and publishing them on social media. Only the parents of that child have the right, if they wish to share material, but certainly not someone who doesn't have material, and it's to protect the child, absolutely.
If we look at a Sunday school coordinator, for instance, if the Sunday school coordinator decided to use social media, then what are the considerations when it comes to governing Sunday school specifically?
Look, if, for example, they were promoting the fact that the Sunday school exists, information about what kind of activities would be happening there, that's absolutely fine. What you should avoid is literally taking photographs of the children as subjects, but essentially promoting the activities, encouraging members of the congregation to bring their children to Sunday school. That's the sort of thing that a social media platform would be ideal for. And then sharing information among, because you're creating communities, so the members of a congregation become that community. They're the fans on a particular Facebook page. So that is, the idea is that these guidelines are not seen as a way of the church trying to control the life of people and to control, to limit their freedom of expression. On the contrary, this is about encouraging, say, share the message, share the good vibes, but do it in a way which is respectful of the church's values, do it in a way which promotes the spiritual principles, and do it in a way which looks good. You want it to look professional.
As an easy sort of, like the most basic, for someone who's been watching this and is still confused about things, would it be a good rule of thumb to say, before you do anything on social media relating to using the church's material, the church's recordings, the church's music, the church's emblem, just check with your rector first. Your rector should know and be able to point you in the right direction and steer you back onto the straight and narrow path, as it were.
Absolutely so. Absolutely so. And my understanding is that these guidelines are going to be posted onto the church's official website. They'll be easily available and easy to understand. And certainly, as you said, get guidance from your rector. If you have any doubt, that's the first place to go to.
So Dimitri, I want to come to a section, a topic that's very close to my heart, because digital strategy is what I do on a day-to-day basis. When you talk about using social media for official communication purposes, be it at congregation level, district level, area level, or even at the church as a whole, what are the kind of things, the considerations that need to be taken if you are going to be implementing a strategy? If you are going, at least, first of all, have a strategy, correct?
That's the start. That's absolutely the start. Because what you want to make sure is that you have a consistent message that is going out, whichever platform you're going to be using. You want to make sure that it's consistent with the image of the church. You want to make sure that it's consistent with the spiritual principles and the values. So you begin essentially developing the strategy that says, we're going to put this on television, then we're going to take certain aspects, put it onto this we're going to put it onto Facebook. Each of those has got certain unique characteristics. So you want to make sure that you're using the best of each of those platforms. So, before making use, set clear, achievable, and measurable goals. How will you know whether this particular communication campaign has been effective? So we want to reach so many people in a particular age group. That's a specific and it's a measurable goal. Employ an integrated campaign that utilizes the full potential of both traditional and social media. As we're doing, for example, with this particular interview, where you'll be using both your TV channel, which reaches a very wide audience, but then you can start targeting, because that's the beauty of social media. You can be talking to one person. It's that specific. Then identify who's your target audience. Who are you speaking to? You're not just putting it out there as a general. You want to be very specific. So if I'm speaking to a younger audience, I want to speak in a language that they are used to, they're familiar with. If I'm speaking to the older members of our congregation, I want to speak in a respectful tone. I don't want to be, doing lingo with them. Not to downplay that they are fun people, but we want to speak to them in a particular tone. So be clear who's that target audience, and use the right channels. We know, for example, that I used the example of the older members of our congregations. They may not be as familiar with Instagram, but some of them are using Facebook. It doesn't mean that they're not using the social media platforms. Some are saying, no, I don't know this computer stuff. It's too much for me. I just watch TV. I like my TV. So that's, you're speaking on the right channel. And importantly, having a social media communications team, making sure that you have dedicated people, because remember, you are starting up a conversation here. So when people post, they expect a response. You're not just putting out, like on TV, putting out a one-way message. Social media is about engagement, and you measure the success of your campaign by the amount of engagement. How many likes did I get? How many dislikes did I get? How many shares did I get? Where did people share to? What kind of engagement? And allow for several trustworthy people to respond to user comments. So make sure that the people that are responding on behalf of the church are trusted individuals, that people say, okay, my pastor responded, my rector responded, whoever it was that. And most important, inform people when you're putting new content out there. So we mentioned earlier that on a Monday there's certain material that goes out. Let people know. That's how you get people to engage with the content.
It's all about consistency, for sure. Once you start getting users, and we talk about this in the sphere of work that I'm in currently, we talk about this user funnel and the user journey, and making sure that you're along the journey every step of the way. That's all good and well for an official communication channel. How should I behave personally? And I say should, not must behave, because these are, as we said, they're guidelines. But how should I behave personally, in my personal capacity, on social media? Bearing in mind that these days, what happens on social media and what happens in real life are much more closely interwoven than they may have been in the past.
Absolutely. Look, I think the key principle there is, if you wouldn't say it to a person, don't say it on social media. It's as simple as that. You have to remember, and certainly as an employee of the church, people know that you're an employee of the church. You represent the church. If you wouldn't behave in a certain way at work, certainly don't do so on your social media, your personal social media accounts. As a member of a congregation, exactly the same thing. And this is not about, as I said earlier, stifling people's freedom of expression, but it's simply saying, if you wouldn't do it at a divine service, you wouldn't stand up and say something political, for example, don't do it on social media.
It's a very good and important thing to mention, because sometimes people do feel like there's the anonymity of the social media space. So I don't have to be accountable for what I say on social media. But as we've seen in the past, it does affect you personally. Dimitri, the last point that I want to come to is, if I am, and I mean this may form part of a greater conversation, but about compartmentalizing the different spheres of your life. Know and understand that on social media, those do become interlinked. That when you are Dimitri walking down the street as the regulatory affairs expert, that person in the boardroom, that person in meetings, that person in Zoom is the same person on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and you should behave in that manner.
100%, and I think your last comment was absolutely critical. That it's so important. We don't become somebody else just because we're using this anonymous platform. It's exactly the same person. So you want to maintain your integrity as an individual. You're not going to go and do something because the other person's not standing there in front of you and you think you can just insult them, for example. So I think you wrapped it very beautifully there with your final comment.
So thank you very much, Dimitri.
Thank you, Lance. Fantastic interview, and I hope your viewers are going to enjoy it.
Thank you. So one realizes how important it is to always act responsibly when using social media. If you have any further questions regarding social media or our social media guidelines, do contact us on info@nac-sa.org.za. That's info@nac-sa.org.za. So from me, Lance, and Dimitri, thank you so much for joining us.